Before Trump's second term, we all lived through the agonizing, slow-motion collapse of the United States that was the Biden administration. That was absolutely disastrous. We had to watch America rapidly lose all its prestige and all of its respect on the world stage, being led by a geriatric president who was obviously dementia-ridden, could barely string together sentences, and could hardly even get up a set of stairs without falling over. It was an absolute catastrophe. After that, getting someone back like Trump, who is undeniably very energetic, very forceful, very coherent, and really incredibly charismatic too, it is like a breath of fresh air. It feels really good to get someone back into the president's seat who seems like they know what they are doing and at a minimum has the capacity to be a good leader. The 4 years of the Biden administration were basically a 4-year-long humiliation ritual that America was dragged through on the world stage before Trump came back to rattle things up. So it makes all the sense in the world that Americans would want Trump back after an embarrassing 4 years. But when you understand how American politics really works, that behind the scenes, there's really only one group of people pulling the strings of both sides and ultimately installing who they want as president while going through all the theatrics that we call an election, which is really just a show to get we the people to consent to whoever's being installed by that much more powerful group, then you can much more clearly see that Trump was installed for a second term very intentionally by a powerful group with a hidden agenda. Trump's second term has an entirely different character than the first, and this really couldn't possibly be more apparent. He is on a mission, a very aggressive one, and he has two objectives in this mission. The first is to make himself and his family very wealthy and very powerful by seizing as much control of the US economy as he can as quickly as possible. And he's already been going about that in a number of ways. The second is to advance the interests of Israel and the Jews who put him in office for a second time, who have more than likely actually been controlling him for many years. Now, because today Trump is stomping all over long-standing diplomatic rules, leaping over the boundaries in our checks and balances system, and completely ignoring even the Constitution, it's very important to understand his guiding philosophy because it looks like he's chaotic and disjointed, but in reality, he is operating on the basis of a certain philosophy and psychology that I don't think very many people understand. But because of the extensive research I've done into the conspiratorial and counter-narrative space, I see it very clearly, and I think the more people who understand his nature and his guiding philosophy, the easier it will be for people to make sense of what is actually going on in the bigger picture. Now, so much of what he does appears to be chaotic and nonsensical, but in reality, he is following a very specific pattern, and that pattern is of a Jewish mafia boss. Now, I specifically say Jewish mafia boss because you have to understand going into this discussion that there is already a lot of moral and psychological overlap between those two worlds, the Jewish world and the mafia world. I went into this in great detail in lesson 9 of my Talmudic teachings course, how there's a tremendous amount of moral overlap between the mafia and the Jewish moral code. For example, they both see themselves as insiders, a separate group that is superior to and separate from mainstream society. They have a very intense loyalty to each other above everyone else and even to the detriment of everyone else. And they're always willing to push boundaries and very manipulative and exploitative, especially with respect to financial dealings. Historically, they're very willing to break norms and even break laws in pursuit of very financially lopsided deals that are to their advantage. Now, there's a whole lot of backstory to why Jews evolved that way historically that I go into in great detail in my Talmudic teachings course. But to bring it back to Trump, this is why he's doing seemingly inexplicable things like being very disrespectful and even borderline hostile to traditional allies of the United States, while treating countries that are traditionally our enemies or rivals, like China or Russia, with a great deal of respect. It's because he sees people who adhere to international laws and play within the boundaries of traditional diplomacy as being weak because they are constrained by a set of rules. To Trump, being able to break existing rules and create new ones, that is real power, and that's what he respects. For example, when European leaders recently allowed Trump to bully them into accepting a 15% tariff rate, which at the beginning they thought was a worst case scenario, and in reality it turned out to be their best case scenario. And not only that, they had to buy an enormous amount of energy products from the United States, and they made this deal with basically getting no concessions back from the United States at all. Trump does not view them as partners in making a deal. He doesn't walk away from that deal with respect. He walks away from a deal like that with contempt because he was able to demonstrate that they are weaker and inferior to him. He sees them the same way a mafia boss would see a square businessman when he comes to the mafia boss for help. He would view him with contempt. On the other hand, Trump respects Presidents Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin because they are other mafia bosses. And like a mafia boss, he will have tremendous respect for other bosses. He knows they are powerful. He knows they are ruthless. He knows they will get their way. And they're not going to let stupid things like laws or rules or traditions get in the way of what they want to accomplish. In them, he sees power, and he likes it because that's how he sees himself. Now, on the other hand, that respect is probably not reciprocated because for sure, they and most of the rest of the world sees how much deference Trump pays to Bibi Netanyahu and his Jewish masters in Israel in general. You would not see the president of China or the president of Russia pulling out the chair for Bibi Netanyahu and allowing Netanyahu to answer their questions for him. So it is very unlikely that these mafia bosses, Putin and Jinping, respect Trump the same way he respects them. But setting that aside, the characteristic of having contempt for people who allow themselves to get bullied or beaten, even when you're making a deal with them, is very Jewish. Historically, Jews have a tremendous amount of fight in them. For thousands of years, they have lived in very antagonistic relationships with other races and cultures around them. And they have dealt with conflict and expulsion and even torture and execution because of their beliefs and the incompatibility of those beliefs with those other races and cultures that they have lived among. That very deeply rooted sense of mythology that becomes like a driving force causes them to think that you should fight for your people or your race or your culture or your nation just as hard as if your life depended on it. And that level of defensiveness and protectiveness should be extended to your fight for your money too. So anybody who gives up money in a deal, it is viewed as badly as if you're giving up your nation or your race or your culture or your faith. That is how Jews view it. And this is because Jews, more than any other group of people on earth, they understand money as a proxy for human energy. Money animates human action. Therefore, whoever controls money controls human action. So because of that, anybody who gives up money in a deal is therefore giving up their power and giving up their control, and therefore they cannot be respected. It is a very Gentile characteristic to treat enemies who surrender with mercy and give them better treatment than the people who go on fighting. This is kind of a Gentile way to get people to surrender and stop fighting anytime there's a conflict. But it's very Jewish to have more contempt for people after they capitulate, so that there's actually a disincentive to surrender. Jews are very much a conquering people in their hearts, but because of this unique characteristic, they actually have more contempt for whatever they are able to conquer. And they end up treating it very poorly because they view it as being weak. So that's how Trump has been dealing with nations in Europe or with Canada, while with Russia or China, even though he came out having a very aggressive posture with those nations, he keeps giving them extensions and exemptions and basically give them every chance in the world to come around and make a deal with the United States because he basically wants to see them succeed. He wants to see them succeed because he wants to make a deal with them because he respects them as other crime bosses. And on that note, it does deserve to be said that Trump is probably breaking the law by making all of these trade deals and slapping tariffs on all the countries that he's done. His entire legal foundation for all of that has been very sketchy from the very beginning. He basically just declared national emergencies for things that have been going on for a very long time, and then took the power that comes with the ability to declare a national emergency and started signing executive orders left and right and slapping tariffs and trade deals on everybody with basically no legal foundation to even do that. So he has already demonstrated his ability to get away with pushing boundaries and stretching norms and basically tossing the Constitution out the window, and that conveys power. And because nobody has really stopped him or challenged him, he believes that he is essentially above the law, and he only respects other leaders who are going to conduct themselves in the same way. They're either above the law or they are the law because that's how much power they have in their own countries. Now, despite that very shaky authority he used to make these deals and the fact that there's a pretty good chance they might eventually get overturned in court, I don't think he's very afraid of that because he does have many other ways to make people miserable who challenge him or come into conflict with him. One of his favorite tools is simple humiliation. He often starts this tactic on social media, shaming and humiliating a person very publicly, and then he will drag that person into his orbit, into his world, by inviting them to the White House or bringing them to some kind of conference. And in that domain, he has the power and he is in a position to set the rules, but he has already pre-weakened the other party by talking crap about them on social media, saying they're stupid, saying they're bad at their jobs, saying they should be fired or whatever. But more often than not, what he's really doing is softening that person up in order to come in and make a deal on Trump's terms. This is absolutely Trump's pattern. He's been doing it for a very long time, and you're going to see him keep doing it. So whenever Trump comes out heavy at somebody and starts mocking them and criticizing them and humiliating them, he's probably not trying to get rid of them. More than likely, he's probably trying to get them to capitulate. But once they capitulate, they are going to basically be more of a servant to Trump rather than someone that he respects as a partner in a deal. And that deal can never be a fair deal. For Trump, it has to be a deal that makes him look good and puts money in his pocket. He has to get paid just like a mafia boss. One particularly brazen example of this that just hit the news recently is how he made deals with the chip makers Nvidia and AMD to open back up their trade with China, because these companies sell very advanced chips to China. But when he took office, he put a stop to that, citing reasons of national security. Then a little bit later, he went ahead and opened that back up again, but only after Nvidia and AMD agreed to kick back 15% of those sales directly to the Trump administration. This is nothing more than a kickback arrangement, and what he did is he choked off the ability of those companies to sell to China and sold it back to them. He never gave a shit about the national security implications at all, because if he ever did, he threw that out the window as soon as he made a deal. For him, it was always about flexing his power by showing these powerful companies, I'm the boss and you're not going to be able to do business unless you kick back to me. This is exactly what a mafia boss would operate like. Now, that's the way he's going about dealing with successful companies. On the other hand, you have another American chip-making company, Int'l. Now, Int'l has been struggling. So because they are struggling as a company, they don't have the tremendous amount of power and revenue that Nvidia and AMD have. He's making Int'l a different deal. He mocked and shamed and humiliated the CEO of Int'l in order to get him to come to his office and basically beg him to stop. And once he did that, he came out talking about how the CEO is such a great guy and he's so inspiring and so smart. And he kind of had a change of heart. But in reality, what he's doing is taking a stake in Int'l's business. So it's a different racket, but it's still a racket. With Nvidia and AMD, because they were cranking out money, he's saying, you can't keep operating unless you put money in the boss's pocket. That's very mafia. But on the other hand, with a struggling business, he's saying, you're struggling? I got a deal for you. We'll go into business together and I'll kick your business back up. But guess what? A bunch of it belongs to me now. And now that money is going to go into my pocket. And when I say jump, you say how high. That's very mafia. Everything he's doing is mafia type deals. And you have to understand that he is a Jewish mafia boss in order to understand how he's operating as president. Never before in history has a president been so shameless about selling the power of his pen to corporations and billionaires. But it gets even worse than those examples. The worst example that I've seen since Trump took office in his second term is the security for minerals deal that he made with Ukraine. Now, as you guys know, Ukraine has been at war with Russia for several years now, and most of Ukraine's ability to fight that war has been a result of a pipeline of money and weapons going directly from the United States to Ukraine. Now, this has never really been popular with the American public, so him going in there and saying that he's going to end this war was a good political campaign move. However, the way he's doing it is very different and it's very mafia. Basically, the deal works like this. Ukraine has a tremendous amount of minerals and rare earths, which the United States desperately needs. They have so much unexplored in their soil, it's an estimated $15 trillion of minerals at today's prices. The United States desperately wants to get its hands on those things. And guess what? More than likely, so does Russia, because the highest concentration of those minerals and rare earths is in the regions that are being fought over by Russia and Ukraine. So that said, back in July, the Trump administration negotiated a new deal with Ukraine. Ukraine would be cut off from all free military supplies and weaponry like we had been giving them before. From that point on, if they wanted to continue having American weapons, they would have to pay for them. But they obviously don't have the money to pay for them, so they made them a deal. the United States would get a 50% stake in all of the minerals that exist in the ground underneath Ukraine. Obviously, they still need weapons because they're still in the middle of a war. So now the United States is forcing them to pay for any further weapons, which obviously they're still going to buy because they still need them because they're still in the middle of a war. But they're going to pay for it with their unexplored minerals, which only American companies are going to have the rights to explore. Then whatever is explored and mined and processed is going to be a 50-50 split between the United States and Ukraine. However, this whole enterprise is not going to pay any taxes to Ukraine. So Ukraine is not going to even be able to pay for a lot of their security. They're going to have to go in debt and borrow the money from the United States to pay for these weapons. It's honestly an amazing racket as mafia rackets go, because Ukraine was far more likely to make a deal years ago with Russia in order to keep the war from being prolonged. However, they didn't do that because they had an enormous amount of money and military support coming from the United States. Now that the plug's been pulled on all that support, and they can only continue it by going deep into debt with the United States and handing over a lot of their sovereign wealth in the form of those resources, they are basically a servant of the United States from this point on. So now the United States actually has an interest in creating a ceasefire arrangement with Russia, because now the United States wants that war to end because it's going to make more money on the minerals being mined out of Ukraine rather than on selling weapons to Ukraine, which is how they were making money before. Either way, Ukraine is being bullied and basically stripped, and the way it's being stripped down is as though a mafia had taken over. And that's because a mafia did take over. That mafia is the United States government, and the boss of that mafia is Trump. But he's not just any mafia boss. I specifically said he is a Jewish mafia boss, and this is why. It's not just because he's helped Israel make their genocide a core part of his foreign policy, or because he's helped American Jews get revenge on their universities to the tune of billions of dollars in reparations for them alone, or because he suggests that the Epstein scandal, which is probably how they compromised him to begin with, is nothing but a Democrat hoax. It actually goes deeper than that because more than likely Trump is Jewish himself. There's actually quite a lot of reporting in the conspiracy space that Trump himself converted to Judaism back in 2017. This was something that was leaked by several whistleblowers inside the administration at the time. His own son-in-law is Jewish, and his daughter Ivanka converted to Judaism during his last term. He also personally admitted to being a practitioner of Kabbalah, which is a mystical form of Judaism, back in 2004 in his book, The Way to the Top. And bizarrely, he also refused to place his hand on the Bible when he was sworn in for his second term, despite the fact that he did put his hand on the Bible when he was being sworn into his first term. But if, like those whistleblowers reported, he actually did convert to Judaism during his second term, that would make sense why he did put his hand on the Bible the first time and refused to do it the second time. And believe it or not, this is all just the beginning of his extensive Jewish connections. There's a whole lot more, which I'll go into in another video. So all that said, I don't think he is bending over backwards to help Jews in every conceivable way because he got all those massive amounts of donations from Jews and from Israel-connected lobbyists. I think they are giving him all those massive donations because he is Jewish, and they know it, but the rest of us don't. And he's not just any old regular Jew. He is a boss in the international Jewish mafia, which, based on the brilliant reporting of a journalist named Whitney Webb, as she documented extensively in both of her books, Nation Under Blackmail, the international Jewish mafia is a real international crime entity, and so powerful, it basically exists above the level of international intelligence operations like Mossad or MI6 or the CIA. Arguably, it is that international Jewish mafia that exists above those organizations and actually coordinates between them. So when people say something like the Epstein scandal was being run by Mossad, there's actually a pretty good chance that the Epstein trafficking ring was being run by that international Jewish mafia and using Mossad in order to do it rather than the other way around. But like any mafia, the strength of the boss is not in his own power, but in the power of the soldiers who are loyal to him. Trump has now become so powerful he has directly taken on the US Congress and multiple federal agencies multiple times and won every time. How can he do that? Well, it's certainly not because he's so smart or because he has so much personal power, or definitely not because the truth is on his side. He has the support of this internationally organized, incalculably wealthy, radical Zionist Jewish mafia behind him. And aside from controlling vast amounts of wealth and controlling most of what people perceive through their control of media and social media narratives, they also exercise direct control of powerful individuals in many countries and many organizations, which was precisely the purpose of the Epstein trafficking ring. And believe it or not, operations like that are nothing new. There have been many similar trafficking rings going back at least 2 centuries in my research. It is an old pattern, it's a trick that's worked for a long time, and they've been doing it since at least the 1800s. Epstein is just the latest, and probably the grandest, in what is actually a very old and very reliable trick that they've been doing for centuries. And I've documented and discussed that extensively in a lot of my other research, which I've been posting for years. So if you learn about the moral code of Jews and the secret beliefs and business practices they operate on, and also learn about the Mafia and how they operate, and put these two things together, that's when you'll start understanding Trump. He has exercised so much conflict of interest in his second term, he has practically turned it into his own industry. And like any real mafia boss, he's very unafraid of ever being held accountable to that, because he knows he has the power of the very powerful, internationally organized Jewish mafia behind him, and he will never be held to account. Because even if he is, the lives of the people who take him on can be made very, very miserable by that mafia who is behind him. And if you doubt me on that, then just look at what happened to Representative Thomas Massey's wife less than a week after he came out in an interview and said that everybody in Congress has an IPAC handler that basically tells them what to do and how to vote. That guarantee of your life being made miserable if you defy Jewish power is generally enough to keep everybody in line in the governments and major corporations of the West. In the big picture, what you are really observing is a coup of the United States government happening right before your eyes in real time. That is why Trump is rapidly hiring and firing to shape an organization made out of radical Zionist and rabid Trump loyalists, signing and implementing new executive orders so fast that people can barely keep up with them and certainly mount challenges to them, and undergoing a radical renovation of even the White House and turning it into basically his personal Versailles palace. For example, that $200 million ballroom extension that's being added on to the White House, which is very ostentatious and more palatial than has ever been associated with the US government, that is going to be paid for by private donations. And a lot of people who support Trump have been cheering that on, because they're saying that is very respectable, because he's not doing it with government taxpayer funds. He's doing that with his own funds. And I don't understand how people can't realize. Don't you guys get it? If it's being paid for with private funds, that means it doesn't belong to you and it doesn't belong to your nation. It is personal property, because Trump is moving into the White House and turning the entire thing into his property. That's a very brazen, very obvious sign that he intends to stick around. He is not acting like someone who's on a 4-year lease. He's acting like someone who owns the White House. And I'm sure that's exactly how he sees it, because that's exactly how the Jewish mafia behind him sees it. He's not going anywhere in 2028. He's settling in for the long haul, because the Jewish mafia is settling into ownership and control of the United States for the long haul. And to make things worse, Trump is more emboldened every single day that he gets away with all this, because every day he pushes the boundaries more and people allow him, he becomes more dictatorial in nature. And that builds his confidence in knowing that he can basically get away with anything, and he won't be getting pushback on it. He'll actually be getting cheered on. And rather than being challenged by other powerful people, those people want to jump aboard because they see how much power Trump is gathering. A very clear sign is being sent to Trump that the more authoritarian he becomes, the more his base cheers, and the more his political lackeys and staff and executives from his client corporations rapidly move to turn his every whim into official state policy. If in any history class you've ever taken, you wondered how several hundred-year-old republics suddenly turn into fascist dictatorships, now you know, because you're watching it happen in real time right before your eyes. Now, as this happens, the rest of the world will probably tolerate it for a while, but they will inevitably move on, because he's alienating even longtime allies and partners with his mafia boss-like conduct. And because the heads of those countries are unlikely to tolerate it for very long, they will simply move to start bypassing trade with the United States and make new international agreements with each other that cut out the United States completely. Now, that will all take at least a few years, but a few years is an eternity at the speed that Trump is moving in order to destabilize the country from within and consolidate control of its institutions underneath the United States government. The bottom line in all this is that the Jewish mafia is in full control of the United States now. They stole it fair and square. And the absolute number one thing that they have in their corner is the mass collective denial of Americans, especially those on the right, that any of this is even happening. Because now you have the right wing, which traditionally is the party of more freedom and less government and more free market control, cheering on the rise of a man who is obviously a dictator, who is doing the exact opposite of all those things, giving much more power to the federal government, seizing control of the economy, and picking winners and losers by selecting particular corporations that are going to be winners because they are getting pumped full of government money. This is the absolute opposite of all the values that the right wing has traditionally believed in, and yet they are cheering it on simply because they've been so browbeaten for so long by the radical left that they can hardly even recognizing that they have put a dictator into office who is going to turn America into, at a minimum, some type of soft fascism with state-run capitalism, and it could even get considerably worse than that. However, by the time he's done consolidating his power, it will be too late to do anything about it because he has already been so enabled by his base, who is ignorant and cheers him on, and by the cowardice of other people, especially in his own party, who refuse to challenge him. Because at some point, he's simply going to do whatever the hell he wants, and that's going to involve liquidating his enemies, even if they are in his own party. You've already witnessed him starting to turn against his own party very angrily when asked about the Epstein scandal. So you cannot be surprised if you are on the right wing and you have been supporting Trump for many years, and all of a sudden he turns on you and starts to label you or your beliefs or your organization as an enemy of the state, and then turns all that government power he's been consolidating on you, you cannot possibly say you were surprised, because you were probably educated enough in your lifetime to understand what fascism looked like and how dictators seize control of governments. However, there's a pretty good chance that you were in denial about it when you saw Trump doing it simply because you believed in him so much. And I'm not saying this to shame you or embarrass you or to blame you, but I am saying this to you so you can wake up sooner rather than later. Because by the time you realize that we indeed have a fascist dictatorship in the United States, which will be fully formed in only a few years, it will be way too late to do anything about it.